Evening. So I've done this talk a whole bunch of times on various versions of C#, and I generally like to start with a question for you guys, which is, assuming you're C# programmers, what do you want to know? No, so what feature do you want to have added to the language? So imagine you're king for the day, you're the product owner for the C# language, and you want to go ahead and add something in. What is the feature you would like to go add to C#?
Object destructuring.
Object destructuring. Okay, do you want to give us a little bit more information about what that is?
TypeScript destructuring an object's properties into variables and
Okay. So Steve at the back would like a feature that was added in C# 7. So that's done. We've done that. Anyone else? Any other features that you'd like to add?
Awesome. Don't make you check for nulls.
Don't make you check for nulls. Okay, that's a tall order, but we can talk about that. Other features.
Python style list comprehension.
List comprehension, Python style. Okay. Anything else? The reason why I find this question really interesting is by the number of responses, meaning the few responses that we have. It turns out that we're programming and using a product every day, and it turns out we're fairly satisfied. And if you go look at the other products you have, pick your car, pick your stove, pick something that you use on an everyday basis, I would expect that it's fairly easy for you to come up with new features you'd like to have. And yet here we are in a language that is entirely electronic, is totally digital. We can add the features. In fact, you guys can go in and add the features because of the fact that it is open source. And we're generally pretty satisfied. And so when I go in and say, hey, let's go do a talk on the next version of C#, in this case C# 8, one of the things you should be asking is, well, I'm kind of pretty satisfied right now, so let me think of something that I'd really like to have. And not surprisingly, it is fairly common for people to bring up features that are already there. It's not an unusual ask, hey, I'd like to get this feature, and what do you know? It's actually been there, it's been there for 2 versions, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's important. The second thing that's worth noting is that there are some significant problems with the language. It is not perfect, and we tend to not realize, because we worked around these issues over time, and we've sort of developed practices and coding disciplines that make us not realize that it could be better. And one of the key ones, and probably the most significant feature that's being added to C# 8, is a concept called nullable reference types. Nullable reference types. Does that strike anyone as funny? Or strange? Why would we add nullable reference types to C# in C# 8? Why would we add those? What does that mean? It turns out that since C# 1, we've had nullable reference types. In fact, all reference types are nullable in C# 1.0. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And in 8, we've now introduced this feature that we've had in C# 1.0, which is nullable reference type. What the heck? Right? You don't get credit for introducing a feature that already existed. That doesn't count as a new feature. So it's a strange term that we're using to call something nullable reference types. So let's step back and sort of introduce the feature. Since C# 1.0, we have had the ability to have a reference type declared that defaults to null. And it turns out that was a really bad idea. Now, it's not unique to C# that we introduced this feature. Most languages support the feature, and most languages support it to be null by default. But it turns out that null is almost always the wrong value. What is the use of having an employee with the value of null? We can come up with expressions and sort of say, well, if the value is null, that means I don't know. Right? Or the value can be, if the value is null, that means specifically there is none. But generally speaking, when we start to talk in an OO world, if if we have something, it must be something that's tangible, something that's an instance of something, not null. And it turns out when we instantiate, we default to null, which is not the value we generally want. And so we've got a language that we've all put up with and been quite content with, but in reality, it causes us to have null reference exceptions because we dereference a variable that is in fact null. And there is never a case, and I use that word intentionally, it's fairly strong, but there's never a case where a null reference exception is not a bug. So we have built into the language this feature that says when you dereference something and it is null, you're going to get a null reference exception and it is always a bug. Now, the exception might be if you're writing the compiler, and you actually want to test for null reference exceptions, there might be cases where it's not a bug. But other than that, if you're exposing a null reference exception in your code, something has gone wrong. And your app should probably shut down. This is a surprise. Nothing intentional was done here that says, yeah, let me go ahead and throw a null reference exception. Even if you pass a variable into a function, and inside that function, you don't check for null because you're like, I don't need to check for null. I'll just go ahead and do a dereference of the variable, and if it throws an exception, then I guess the user will know, the caller will know, hey, don't pass null. It's an invalid value. But in actual fact, no. If you pass null in and you don't want to allow nulls, you need to throw an argument exception to say, hey, this argument is invalid. And then actually specify which argument is in fact invalid rather than a null reference exception, which pretty much tells you nothing besides the fact that you made a mistake. So we have this feature built into the language that is guaranteeing to expose your incompetence. And the CSharp team would like to fix that. What's interesting about the problem is that if we acknowledge back in CSharp 1.0 we made a mistake because we decided to default a reference type to be null, what are we going to do in CSharp 8? Do we change it so that by default a reference type is not null? You're going to go ahead and declare a string and say, no, strings by default are not null. Turns out that many of us have written code that have assigned null to a variable, a reference type, probably because some other warning occurred that said, hey, you didn't initialize it. You're like, well, I don't know what to initialize right now. Let me just set it to null. Right? But when you set it to null, you're saying, hey, this string, which I'm going to go ahead and assign null, if I change the language to say, no, don't assign it null, it's now not null, but it's now not nullable, then I'm going to break all that code. And the CSharp team has been extremely diligent through the years of saying it is more important for us not to break your code than it is for us to introduce a new feature. And I mean that literally speaking. There are times that the CSharp team has decided, no, we're not going to introduce that feature because doing so will break backwards compatibility, and it is more important that we keep and maintain backwards compatibility than we introduce a new feature. Now this is not always the case, but the majority of the time that's exactly what's happening. And the times where it hasn't, backwards compatibility has been lost are extreme circumstances, like extreme scenarios that you're not going to encounter very often. So we could go ahead and say, no, if we go declare a string, and we're going to change it to nullable by default, not nullable by default, and I'm going to break all this code. So that doesn't seem like such a good idea. What if we instead go, let's call it string exclamation point to say, string exclamation point is not null. And if you assign it null, then we're going to go issue a compiler warning or compiler error. Say it up, you declare this as a string exclamation point or a string to say, hey, this value cannot be set to null. But if we did that, then we would still have the problem that by default, strings would be null. And so we're not really fixing the problem. We're giving you a way to declare something as not be null, but we're not fixing the root problem, which is it should not be null to start with. And so we're sort of at the horns of a dilemma. What do we do? And the CSharp team has decided that the way to handle this is to actually change the default value for a reference type to be not null. Excuse me. They change it so that by default, a reference type is not nullable. And yes, that means if you go declare string name equals null, you will get a compiler indication that there's a problem. Now, I use the word indication carefully because what I'm essentially saying is it is not an error. It is a warning. Not just that, but it is not a warning by default. You have to turn the feature on. So the way that the CSharp team is saying this is, hey, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have gone ahead and used this value of null by default. However, to go ahead and change your code would cause lots and lots of compiler warnings. And we think people should opt into that scenario rather than have it be that way by default. And so when you go ahead and upgrade to the C# 8 compiler, you have to specifically say, please, may I have some more? I would like to go ahead and turn on these warnings. Right? I like the feeling of being told I'm wrong. This feels good. Questions so far?
That was not the case in the early release, right?
Early release of C# 8?
Yes.
I believe even in C# 8 you do have to make some specific changes to go turn the feature on, but I think the change is pretty innocuous. You have to basically say use the most recent version of the compiler rather than the major version. So preview 8, it's been a while now since I actually turned this on, but there is a preview of this compiler and in preview version of Visual Studio. Obviously you can download the source code and compile Roslyn as well. And you can go ahead and test this out. I've been using this version of Visual Studio with nullable reference types turned on for quite some time. It's pretty good. You know, I don't really have a daily problem where it should be a warning. And I don't recall whether you explicitly turn it on or not. I think there's been 2 versions, and I'm not sure which one we ended up with. But the long-term plan is that you have to turn it on explicitly. It is not on by default. Other questions? Okay, so I've left this on the screen. I think I've pretty much covered most of the scenarios. There are a couple more nuances that are worth pointing out. Right now, if you go ahead and declare an int question mark, you are saying it is nullable. But if you declare a string without the question mark, which isn't allowed before C# 8, but if you declare a string without the question mark, it is nullable. So we have an inconsistency. Right? One of the inconsistencies of the language is that value types are not nullable unless you decorate them with a question mark, and reference types are nullable, and we need to sort of fix that inconsistency. I think that those are sort of the major things to consider. So, what are we going to do about it? First, we need to provide a syntax to expect null. And it's important that you understand that I'm not saying we need to provide a syntax to not expect null. We need to provide a syntax to expect null, which means by default, if you declare something as a string, it does not expect null. So we need to provide a syntax that does expect null, and it's fairly obvious what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and add a question mark. And if you add a question mark to a reference type, you're saying, this is nullable. And if you don't have the question mark, you're defaulting to saying, this is not expected to be null. Okay? Next, we've talked about this already. This should decrease the chances of you having a null reference exception. Because if we know that you're declaring something as not nullable, and you assign the value of null, we can flag a warning. Similarly, if you declare something as nullable, and then you dereference it without checking if the value is null or not, it's likely that it's a null reference scenario. And therefore we can issue a warning in the compiler saying, hey, I think you should check whether the value is null before you dereference. And if you go add the if statement that says, hey, is this value null? And it comes back and says, no, it's not, and then you go dereference it without using the question mark period operator, it will not issue a warning. Because it says, hey, you checked, I know. I know you checked, so therefore I'm not going to worry about this. And that last feature where we go ahead and verify or look at your code to determine whether you checked for null or not, that's flow analysis that we're going to go do at compile time to determine, hey, are we making sure that the value for this variable is not null? Let's take a look. Okay. How big should we go? Yes? Is that big enough? I have a test class here, and in the test class I'm declaring a field called number 10 Downing Street. And it is of type address. That's irritating, that stays there. And it is of type address. And you'll notice that the address has a street, a city, a zip. It actually has two streets. It also has a street, street 2 in addition to street 1. And following on with what we said about the syntax, we can go ahead and do a check here and says, hey, because we haven't set street 2 in that initialization of the field, and then we go ahead and dereference to get the length from street 2, it should say, hey, wait a second, you didn't set this, and now you're going to go ahead and dereference it. What's going on? And we actually get a warning. If we hover over here, you'll see that there's a warning. It says, hey, possible dereference of a null reference. It knows that there's something about this field that says, hey, you should not dereference it without first checking for null. And if indeed, if we go look at the declaration of this, you'll see that street 2 is decorated with a string question mark as a way of explicitly saying this could be null, and if you dereference it without checking for null, you should get a warning to avoid a null reference exception. Okay? Makes sense? Let's go. Next, if we go ahead and declare a variable like text as a string, and then we assign it null, we will get a warning. We're saying the data type is string. By default, reference types are not nullable. If we assign it null, we should get a warning saying, hey Buster, I don't think you really want to do this. You told me you don't want it to be null, and now you're assigning null. That's not a good idea. This should concern you a little bit because I expect in your existing code you do this a fair amount. And most of you do it because somewhere along the line you had a warning that said, hey, this variable is not initialized. Are you sure you want to do something with it? And so you would say, oh, okay, just assign null. Or assign default of t. And when you did that, you were exposing yourself to the fact that you could be having a null reference type, null reference exception later on down the line. And then, similarly, if you go ahead and assign zip, which is also a string, if you go ahead and assign it null, it's going to say, hey, you don't want to be doing that. You told me it's not null, it's not nullable, and now you're assigning it null. That's not a good idea. Next, you'll notice that I can go ahead and dereference zip without ever issuing a warning here. Why? Because I've said it's not null, so you shouldn't be assigning null. There was a warning earlier I told you about, so I don't have to worry about you dereferencing it here. Otherwise I'm going to have 10 warnings when I actually only needed one. One you can fix it. So now when I fix it here, then, of course, I don't need to fix it later because it's totally okay for me to dereference it. One other thing to note is up here where we had the warning because I didn't check for null. If I go ahead and check for null, if number 10.street is null, is not null. You'll notice flow analysis says, oh, no problem, go ahead and dereference it. No big deal. We're going to go ahead and ignore the fact that, that you're dereferencing it because you checked for null. And so we are doing static flow analysis. Now, if you go write this in such a way that it uses reference equals, to say, hey, is this reference equals for null? Or you go write a method that checks for null and then call that method so it's not immediately obvious that inside here you checked for null, it is not going to know. Right? So can you trick the compiler into giving you a warning when you shouldn't? Yes. Which introduces another very important concept in the C# 8 attempt to introduce nullable reference types. And that is that it is a warning and it is not always correct. You could go ahead and do a check for null that the compiler doesn't realize is a check for null. And will still then go ahead and say, hey, this is a nullable type and you're dereferencing without checking for null. In which case you have to go tell it, oh no, I really meant what I was doing there. This is just come this out. You could say, I know better, trust me, I'm a programmer. Which is, you know, you got to be cautious about telling the compiler you know better, but you could do that. Or more than likely, you're going to start out by saying, you're right. Let me go ahead and use the albus operator, the question mark period, to go ahead and verify that no, so no exception is thrown. The default gets returned. Questions?
That's basically like Swift, right?
Who else in the room knows Swift? So my answer is I don't know. Because I don't know Swift. It turns out nobody else does either, so we're doing okay here. I need Kevin. Where's Kevin? Where's Kelly? Oh my goodness, they're not here. So, question-wise, is it like Swift? And I don't know. And are you referring to the nullability?
The question mark and the exclamation point. So basically in Swift, you are allowed to do that and not get a compile error because, like you said, you're kind of forcing it.
You mean on dereferencing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a C# feature. That's been there for since C# 6, I think, maybe 5, but I think it was 6. So that's been around for a long time. So I didn't understand your question. So if you're saying the question mark period operator, what we call the Elvis operator, that's been in the language for a while now. I think it's in C# 6.
Explain the bang.
I will. That's later on. That's a good question. Let me sort of that later on. So it turns out there's 3 types of nullability. There's the obvious one where you do string question mark and I assign it null because it's a nullable reference type. And when we say in C# 8 we're introducing nullable reference types, that's what that means. The way to explicitly declare something as nullable because we're changing the default for something not to be nullable. Okay? You could also go ahead and say, that's not the right syntax, but conceptually speaking, you can go ahead and say, oh, let me declare something as not null, right? But if we did that, then we'd have to go ahead and have all our code add this exclamation point to say, okay, this one's not null, this one's not null, this one's null, and this one's I don't know. So we have sort of 3 types. We'd have, not null, null, and I don't know. And rather than doing that, we say, no, forget that. We're not going to do that. We're going to change this one to be not null. We're only going to have 2. But there is a scenario here where you're assigning string, and I'm calling a library that's compiled with C# prior to C# 8. So this is pre-C# 8, I've got a random null value, and I'm calling it. And pre-C# 8, there was no question mark operator on the declaration of my reference type. So it turns out it is possible that the compiler doesn't know. That's absolutely a possibility. Over time, that will just be reduced. In fact, we can decorate an assembly to say, was this compiled with C# 8 or not? Specifically, was it compiled with C# 8 and nullability turned on? Nullable reference types turned on. But there are scenarios where the compiler won't know. And that's one example. Go ahead.
So in terms of using like string dot is null or white space, all those, it knows that those are null checks, just like you did.
Yeah. So it knows if you do equals null, and it knows if you do is null using pattern matching. It does not know if you use reference equals. If you use the static version string.reference equals, it does not know that that's a check for null. And it turns out, so that's true. If you use, in the case of string, is null or empty, it does not know. Right? It does not know. So it has not gone into every single method and done exclusive analysis and go, oh, is this value null or not null? In fact, you can imagine you got a multi-threaded scenario where a variable could change from underneath you. It didn't know. So one of the things you have to get used to is that, and it's not so bad because it's a warning, but essentially we're saying the compiler does not do perfect static flow analysis. It does a best scenario static analysis, and hopefully it catches the places where you make mistakes. But it doesn't necessarily catch them all, and it is not always right. You may know this value cannot be anything else. But there's scenarios where you could call console.readline, and you can be sure it's never going to be null. Right? That's just not going to happen. There could be an exception, in which case it wasn't assigned, but it's never going to be null. Now, obviously, they'll go back and change the libraries to say, okay, well, we know when console.readline returns something, it's going to return string, not nullable string. And that's easy. So once we compile it, we can make sure go through all those declarations. We can specify when it's nullable and not nullable.
So they intend to do that. They just haven't done it with this release.
Well, they get it for free because it said string, and string is exactly what you want. But all the libraries have not been decorated appropriately to say, okay, no, this is a question mark, or this is nullable, and this one's not. They haven't gone through that, which is a fairly rigorous check of the entire framework. And frameworks are frameworks, and it's a long process. It'll take time for us to get through that. I mean, consider your own libraries, and not just that. Did you get it right when you declared it? There may be times where you just said string question mark, and it could have been a string when you said string, but it actually is nullable. You could actually make a mistake. But the point I'm trying to say is you cannot expect the compiler to be perfect in its analysis. It's going to do a best guess, if you like. Okay. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and I declare a method inline, so this is an inline method, for get null, and it returns null. And then I go ahead and with nullable address, I assign it null, I then set it to, because it's nullable, I then set it to get null address, and you can go ahead and check the value. And we basically say, make default reference types expect non-nullable. By putting a question mark, then we say expect them not to be null. And you should go ahead and do that with the question mark. So I've shown you with that. Lastly, what do you do with var? So in this case, I've gone ahead and declared an inline function. The inline function returns default. So if you guys haven't seen, this is a 7.0, 7.1 or 2 feature. We can just use default without the T. So I've gone ahead and declared an inline function, and I've said it returns the default of T. And then I go ahead and assign text1 equal to the value coming out of that. And I've specifically said this is nullable. I'm putting a question mark on my generic. On my generic type, I put a question mark saying this is nullable. And what is var? It turns out that underneath the covers, we are not introducing a new type. There is no string question mark in IL. It is still just a string. And if we didn't do it that way, compiling something in C#8 with nullable reference types turned on would make it incompatible with libraries that were working in C#7 because the data types wouldn't be defined. Now we can go back, we can sort of backwards port and put those data types into earlier versions. We could try to make a best case scenario. But what's better is to say, hey, let's go ahead and do this in such a way that C#7 continues to work against libraries that compile to C#8. And instead, for methods, variables that are declared inside, in just local variables, it's no big deal, because all the static analysis is done inside. But what happens when we expose it? And in those cases, we're going to go ahead and decorate with an attribute. So the C#8 compiler can see the attribute and respond accordingly, but a C#7 compiler doesn't need to know about a new type, which would have been introduced in broken version compatibility for that type you're compiling against because you upgraded your library, but somebody else didn't upgrade theirs, they compile against you, or they don't even recompile, and now you've got a version compatibility problem. So the only change in terms of your compiled code is an introduction of an attribute that decorates your public interface that a C#8 compiler will know about, and a prior to C#8 compiler will have no knowledge and it won't matter, because they'll just ignore the variable, the attribute. It'll be nothing to do with it. So in this case here, where we return text, and we're actually returning null, that var over there is declared as a string. And it's actually treated, we can go ahead and assign text2, which you'll notice here, text2 is not null. We can go ahead and assign it text3, which is null. There was a scenario you could confuse the compiler and wouldn't know. It is going to look at in a C#7 case, it's going to look at the return, it's going to see a string, and it's going to be, oh, this is totally fine. If it's a C#8 case, then you're going to decorate with a question mark, and the var is going to come across conceptually as nullable. But if you happen to be working across pre-C#8, it's going to just treat it like it did always before. As a string, which interprets in C#8 is not nullable, even though in fact it was. Questions? Either I'm really confusing or I'm just fantastic.
Is there like a best practice to deal with that external call? I mean, just check them all afterwards?
So the best practice is continue what you do prior to C#8. I mean, if you're calling a library that's not been recompiled, you've just got to deal with it the same way as you did before, check for null. Or upgrade the library, right? If it's open source or whatever, just have that. And you know, the reality of it is, even if somebody says that it's not null, it's possible that they could confuse the compiler and actually return null. I mean, that is possible. You can do that. So in some ways, if you want to be fail-safe, you want to go in and check your variables and do stuff like that. But it depends on how much the code you control, how much, what libraries you're calling, how well can you trust the people writing the library you're invoking, that kind of stuff. Thoughts about this feature? Yes? No, not sure. Suggestions about the features, a better way we should do it.
I just want to admit that when I see new material like this, I understand the concept. I read your article in February in Magazine. But I always consistently have a little bit of a smoke and mirrors concept until I try it out myself and run the scenarios myself. So I apologize for not being more adept.
And so, you know, just to repeat what he said, right? Number one, he's read about it. He's read a fantastic article about this guy named Mark. That's pretty much what he said. And he gets the concept, and he hears what, I mean, talk about it, but the reality, you won't get into it until he starts to program. And frankly, that's true with every feature in C#. I mean, it's very rare. Maybe putting underscores in the middle of digits, you know, the underscores separated in the middle of a large number is, you know, one case where you don't need to try it out. Okay, I got it. I can put an underscore there. But can you put it in the beginning and the end? Not sure yet. Well, on 7.3 you can, but I didn't know that before. So whatever, yeah, 7 point something, 7.x, I don't know exactly. Yeah, so that's true with both things. And I would say, as a learner, the best way to learn is to write unit tests against your code. Right? If you want to learn a feature, write unit tests against the feature. That's exactly what you see me do here. Right? It's not like I started and I went to a class, listened to this guy, you know, Mark, teach about HC, you know, that didn't exist. The guy hadn't got up yet. And so that's the best way to learn it. And as we start to get into other features, in some cases I don't even have a compiler, right? I mean, there's new features coming out, and like you read the spec. Like, oh, let's hope this makes it. I don't know, right? We're not sure yet.
As an older person, I've learned that I have to let go of my previous experience. When you're learning new material, the thing that will kill you the quickest is to say, well, if I was in C++, this would happen.
Yeah.
So you gotta let go of that. And so I don't even want to let my mind go there too far. I want to just get hold of that and then try that.
And I agree, we do have to let go. And the hard thing about this is we are changing the way the language worked for the last 7 versions. And it is not an insignificant change. And when you open up your C# 7 code and the C# 8 compiler, and you push compile, and you turn on nullable reference types, you're going to get a gazillion warnings. And you're going to have to work through, okay, what do I do? And the C# team is still trying to decide, what is the granularity with which you can turn the feature on? Is it per function? Is it per file? Is it per class? Is it per assembly? Because, you know, Roslyn compiles when it's got 4 million lines of code. We're not going to get through that in a day. It's going to take a while. If we turn it on now, there can be so many warnings, we're going to just turn them off. We're like, forget it. I'm better than the compiler because it's issued all these warnings and this code's been around for a long time, so I guess I don't need this feature. And that's the last thing we want to do. We want to give you a way to introduce it gradually so that, you know, over time you have the default and we move towards the default of being null.
It's a great feature, because I got to tell you, kind of nice guys can't hear older guy, you know, maybe trying to pick up some of these newer languages. The few times that I have noodled around in it, null exception is the one that pretty much stops me every time. It takes me a lot longer to figure out how to get to the bottom of it. So it's a great feature, and that's a good topic to bring to the floor.
So one thing that's also interesting about the C# 8's introduction of nullable reference type is they've already gone through this change in the language in TypeScript. So TypeScript started out with, by default, a type being nullable, and then went to introduce the concept of being not nullable. They've already gone through this transition. And they learned a whole bunch of stuff, and we're able to take advantage of the C# because we're coming, you know, next. Or second or third, I'm not sure how many languages have this, but certainly TypeScript did it first in terms of mainstream languages. And so we are gaining the experience of what the changes that they've gone through with TypeScript, or we've gone through with TypeScript, I guess, I'm not sure how to say that. And now we're getting to sort of reap the benefits of going through in a gradual manner.
I kind of like the idea of being able to write my own libraries, and within those libraries I'm calling different functions, and I don't have to worry about checking for null all the time. It's just extra things I have to read, extra things my mind has to process when I'm trying to.
One of the coolest places that I see this is, I have for a long time wanted attributes on arguments that specify not null. And instead of me going ahead and inserting an if statement in the first 4 lines of my code to say if it's null, then throw an argument exception, now I can go and make the variable, the argument, a string, and if you call it and you pass it something that's nullable, you will get a warning in your code. But it turns out you might be calling me from C#7. And so I still need to make the check. And we're going to go through time. So we're going to reduce the number of times this occurs, and over time we'll eventually get there where everybody's using a C#8 compiler, and then we can sort of relax. Or it's not that we can necessarily relax. I think we still have to program defensively. But the times when we make mistakes will not be exposed as often because a warning will show up in somebody's code. Another thing that I tend to do is, I talked to an engineer yesterday. I had a video conference or recording or whatever, and he said, but I don't turn warnings on. And I thought, oh my goodness, I think warnings are great. If you don't have warnings as errors, you're basically saying I'm better than the compiler, and anything the compiler says about my code is just not important. And I'm pretty sure if somebody's going to go through the effort of actually writing warnings that does code analysis and verifies your code at the compiler level or at the code analysis level, they took the time, it was probably a pretty important rule. Now you may be in a scenario where that rule doesn't apply and it misidentified it, fair enough. Fix the code, turn off the warning for that particular case. But I've got to say, 95% of the time, when a warning is issued, I don't even turn the warning off, I just change the code so the warning doesn't appear. Yes, I'm really sure, hey, this one doesn't apply. For example, if I'm working at a utility in, the center of Washington who only works in 3 states and they're never going to go ahead and convert to support multiple languages, okay, then I don't need to have the warnings that talk about, ensuring that I'm language compatible, or what's the word? Localization, that can be localized. So I can turn the warning off. But if ever they get, if ever they get bought, this imaginary utility gets bought by what happens to be in Canada and they speak 3 languages up there, I got a problem, right? I mean, just hypothetically speaking. Okay. Yes, Steve.
So, to your point about checking your arguments with TypeScript, you can, if you're writing all your own code yourself, usually be pretty confident that your arguments are what you think they are, but you're some many away from screwing that up. C# has the added benefit of actually being strongly typed throughout, right? Is there any way to turn on strict mode?
Yeah. So the question is, in the TypeScript case, it's a scripting language, it's not strongly typed. But in C# we are strongly typed. Is there a way to say, hey, be really, really strict? And it turns out the answer is no. It is not possible, and I mean as in terms of, what is possible or impossible. It is not possible to do static code analysis that will always be right. And the example I gave of multi-threading is a perfect example. It is just not possible to know that this value cannot be known. So I want to be very clear, and maybe I said this here, but what this feature does is reduce the likelihood that you are making an error. But you should still program, from a defensive perspective, you should still program the same way. Right? So this reduces the likelihood that the mistake you made not to check will be exposed. You're less likely to get caught in your evil. However, that doesn't mean you should be evil. Right? I can go ahead and declare something as a string, a parameter as a string coming in. And when I do that, I should still check for null, because somebody could be calling me from a C#7 compiler. Or somebody could have done something that it got changed and they were not aware of it. Some weird scenario. It's less likely. But they could have just not turned the warnings on. Or they could have, I know scenarios where somebody said they decided to turn off these major warnings because it was all over the place. They just turned that particular warning. They went into Visual Studio or the command line and said, warning CS0310, I'm just going to turn it off. Well, guess what? They're still calling your code and you still need to check. So I don't think it allows us to be lazy. I think it just allows us to avoid getting caught when we are as frequent.
So kind of off to the side a little bit. What about unit testing it's a good practice to check for nulls.
Absolutely.
And then you continue to do that. in your
So
test.
the question was, should I check for nulls in my unit test? So I think what you're asking is, should I write tests?
Like usually argument null stuff.
Yeah, should I write tests that verify a parameter is not set to null, or verify that a check is being made for null? You know, I think I'd go back to just general unit testing rules. Is there a chance that you made a mistake in this particular scenario? If the answer is yes, then dang it, write a unit test. If you've got a property, it's the name property, and it's the only thing, there's just a name property right there, there's no code in there. Do you need to write a unit test that tests the name property? Well, probably not, right? I mean, you didn't do anything, you don't have any logic in there, you just declared it, maybe you don't. So it sort of depends on your scenario, sort of how strict are you on unit testing. It's probably easier if you go write a unit test that just automatically runs through, using reflection, all your objects and just tests all the values. But what is a correct value to be returned? It's the same thing you gave it. And you did use the template, prop, tab, done. It's not likely to be wrong. So it depends on your tolerance and how good are you at getting your value. Okay, let me just walk through these quickly. It's a lot of text, so I'll try to be quick here. The conclusion, nullable reference types. Wanting to remove a null assignment to a non-nullable type is likely to eliminate a bug. Right? If you have this scenario where you assign null, and you're saying this is now a non-nullable type, fix it. It's likely fixing a bug later on. And this is going to take work, and it is going to take time. You're going to want to choose it in a little bit of chunks. You can sort of take the policy of sort of say, check in code better than you found it. When you edited the file, do a quick run through on that file and say, okay, I've dealt with all the nullability scenarios in this particular file, let's check it in and mark it down, and so you get those checked out. And so we can go at a file level and sort of take an approach to make it better. The other thing about this is, let's imagine you made a mistake and you assigned it null, and then you go, oh no, I want it to be null, let me go make the string question mark, a reference type question mark. Later on, it's going to say, hey, you didn't do a null check. And it's going to tell you that. It's going to tell you, hey, change this to be the question mark period operator, or go ahead and check for null. That's a good thing, right? So the fact that this warning is now cropping up, it's likely because you had a bug there, it just didn't get noticed, or it just didn't happen in that multi-threading scenario where it mattered. So, these warnings that are coming through are likely going to expose some warts in your code. And you should appreciate the times that they do, and therefore go through all your code and just improve it, make it better. In answer to the question earlier about whether it's turned on or off, nullability features off by default in existing projects, so you can delay until the time when you want to deal with this. But if you do a new project, and it's a C# 8 compiler, nullability is turned on. Okay? So a new project, nullability is turned on, you're starting from scratch, you get a green field, it's all there. If you take an existing project and you, quote, upgrade it and open it up in a C# 8 world, then nullability will be off by default. You have to turn it on because there's been a whole bunch of warnings coming out and you don't want to scare you to not paying attention.
Is that in your CS crouch file? Where you turn on and off?
Yes. Yes.
Can you restate what that bang operator means? You're
Oh,
telling
did I not go through that? I am so
it's,
sorry. That's kind
You're
of
telling it, you flagged an error, and I want to ignore that specific error. Are you saying explicitly this cannot be null versus question mark
Yeah.
can potentially be null?
Yeah, let me try to find an example I had.
Recall you had 3 scenarios: default, explicit, not explicit allowed.
Let's go back. When you do this, you're saying it's not null. You're explicitly saying it's not null. Versus the other case where you put a question mark, you're saying if it is null, then do this. Here you're saying, trust me, I'm a programmer. I know this is not null. Don't bother to issue me any warnings. Very similar to a cast operator, right? If you do explicit cast, you may be throwing an exception at runtime because we're still going to check. But you're telling the compiler, I'm a programmer, I know better than the compiler. Good luck with that. So yeah, that's a basically way of saying, trust me, I'm a programmer, this is not null, even though it could be, which is very different than saying, if it is null, then do this. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, enough of that. I already talked about the fact that it doesn't change your code semantically when you mark something as nullable or not nullable. Right? It is still just a string. It is adding metadata to allow us to program against it. It is not semantically changing the way the code operates. It is not a new type. Unlike when you did int question mark, where it was a new type. Okay, new feature. By the way, all these features are in an unknown state. If you go online and you look at the CSharp language and the development that's happening on GitHub, you'll notice that there's about roughly 10 features, and I think all of them except this one are in the proposals, not all of them. I think 8 of the 10, 7 of the 10 are still in the proposal phase, which means they haven't even started writing the code necessarily. They're still in the proposal phase. Now, you can go to branches and you can actually pull out the implementation. So the implementation is still being written, but that's the state. That's where it's at. So it's being written, it's being worked on, but most of them are still flagged as proposals. And they may not happen. And I say this because, hypothetically, I remember writing features, writing about C# 7 and saying, these are all the features in C# 7. And 80% of them came to fruition and showed up. And the other ones didn't, right? And now some of those features like records is being discussed again now for C# 8, but it's still in the proposal phase, and it was in the proposal phase for C# 7, and we had code, we executed, we tried it out, I wrote about it, therefore it was not.
We also have a couple of trays of food back here too, so if you guys want to bite.
In the scenario of more important stuff, there is more important stuff at the back. We're eating. Alright. Okay, so let's talk about some annoyances in the language, or some places where it's fairly laborious. If you want to go ahead and retrieve the last item of an array, you have to go ahead and say array, square brackets, array.length -1, close square brackets. And you can go and retrieve the last item. In this case, we're going to say last item is 8. Great, but that's a pain in the patootie.
So right there.
Yes, there's one extra for it. Well, that's kind of weird. How did I get that in? I do actually have a compiler for this. Those red squiggles, those are not compilers.
Be nice though.
Oh no, oh no. We are in, okay. So let's go ahead and make it much, much simpler. Let's introduce a new type. We're going to call the type index. And we're going to go say new index. We're going to say take the last item, iterate back. And we're going to say count from the end and make that true. Way simpler, right? Surely this is better. No, it's not. It's not. But it is possible in C# 7 for me to override or write an implementation of the index operator that doesn't just take an integer, it actually takes an index, the type. It takes the type index. I can declare an index. I can go ahead and write the definition of an index, and I can pass it in and get the last item. And that's all fine and good, but the syntax is no better than what I have in line above. So not only are we going to introduce the index type, but we're also going to go ahead and add a syntax feature. And now it looks a little bit better. Oh, thank goodness, right? I mean, come on. So underneath the covers, what's going on is we're going to have one that's translating into new index, back 1, counting back 1, just to make sure we're counting back from the end, we count back 1, and we say from the end, that's why it is true, we're going to count back from the end, we're going to go 1. Now if you just pass 1, it's from the beginning. And you could pass an index if you wanted to, but that would be kind of weird. Okay, so we've we've overloaded the index operator for an array to go ahead and allow you to always take an index type as well as an integer. And this works also for longs, by the way, but that's just a
But not negative index?
But what?
No negative index?
There's no negative index right now, that's correct. The question was, is there a negative index? And the answer is no. In fact, it explicitly throws an exception if you look at the code.
And that Boolean, the Boolean true, the count backwards, that's the flag.
Yeah, this says count from end, the name of the variable is from end, and you can set it to true or false. Yeah, that's a good question. Frankly, I've never seen anyone write this code. I did it because I think it's interesting if you understand what's going on underneath the covers, but like that would be very bizarre. Right? Nobody the only people that are writing that code are the people that are testing the language feature. Nobody else is doing that.
Now we got to count back 0 or count back 1?
Yes, you count back 1. That's a good question. If you do 0, it gives you the number of items in the collection. But that would not index well. That would be an exception. So not only are we going to do that, what if we also introduce a range? So now when we go ahead and pass a range into the index operator on your array, instead of returning 1 item or 2 items, we can return n items. And so you'll see here we're saying go ahead and create a range, start with 4, go to the end, and go 2 back, and then return a span that goes from 4, 5, 6. But who the heck would want to write that? What if we could do it like this? Now we're talking, right? Now I can say start at 4, go to the end, go back 2, and now we've got a syntax change to the language both for the index operator to go allow you to do the hat operator, which is a new operator by the way, and you've got a syntax for now addressing a span or a collection of items within your array.
And in this case, there is a space in the hat maneuver.
It's irrelevant. White space, it doesn't matter. There is there, but it's not
Can you take
required.
it out?
Would you like me to take that out?
I don't know.
One of the advantages of working inside PowerPoint is the compiler. If you didn't have people that were so observant, it actually is.
Now the next topic, it's all right.
And actually, I'm pretty confident to say it wasn't there, but PowerPoint decided it would be a good addition. Okay. Not only we can go specify, so it turns out the begin and end are optional. So now we can go dot dot hat 3, and we can specify start from the beginning. And similarly, we can say 3 dot dot and not specify the end. We just want to skip the first one. Does anyone know how you would do this in LINQ? So if you look at the second, this line here, how would you do this in LINQ? You know, it's interesting because it turns out this is really, really simple, but if you had to go write this in LINQ to go ahead and get the array, or in this case it's a span, this was pretend it's an array, you're going to go ahead and type array dot skip to dot, take n, where n is the number of items you want to actually take and go in the end. So you're going to have to do a calculation about how many to do. Right? What a pain in the patootie. And lastly, you can go ahead and do a range.all, which it does return a span, so it changes your data type to be a span instead of an array. But you can go get all the items in that array. By the way, as an FYI, casting an array to a span is an implicit cast. You can cast from an array to a span. It's an implicit cast. So I look quickly at the data types. I'm no longer on the screen, that works. So span is introduced in 7 dot something, I don't remember what, 7.x. I need to actually know what the point releases are so I can really impress people, but I haven't figured that out yet. And then you can see the range and the index. They're fairly simple. Range has a begin and an end, or a start and an end. And an index just has a value and also identification about whether you're counting from the end or not. So really simple types. There's like 10 lines, 20 lines of code for these two classes. They're very, very simple. But don't forget, we also had to go ahead and provide an implementation in the index operator on the arrays for this to work. So, cool features, certainly simplifies our code. It's not revolutionary, but I would bet that once this feature is there, you will use it way more than you're going to go say, array.length -1. So, I really find it, I really appreciate the features that I added that closely change the way I program and change the way I program in the future. Another one, string interpolation. Except for the cases of localization, I always use string interpolation because it's just way simpler to read, way simpler to code, and it was a great simplification over format string. So I use it, except in the case of localization. Hypothetically speaking.
Why would you use span? Where's the...
So that's the data type that's returned here, and it allows you to, so span is a new type introduced, and the purposes of our dealing with sections of a collection without having huge memory impact or without doing copying. So a span is very, very efficient with memory usage. Interestingly enough, right now, I'll leave it at that. I don't think span supports iNumeral, which is
Simple way to return a subset.
Yes,
That's what I call
yes, and efficient. I think that's the most important. Efficient.
Yeah, not copy.
Okay, so there's a new feature also called async streams. I don't know if this one's going to make it or not, but it's one that has been talked about for quite a while. How many of you have used reactive extensions before? Anyone use reactive extensions? So if you're programming in CSharp and you do a lot with events, reactive extensions is a really, really cool library. If you have lots of events coming in and you're trying to handle them as they arrive. And essentially what reactive extensions does, it allows you, in a summary, it allows you to use link over a stream of events. Let me say it again. So reactive extensions allows you to use link over a stream of events. With C# we have an improvement on that. But essentially what it allows us to do is change code that looks like this. If we introduce some an asynchronous enumerator, you can imagine the concept in C#7, we can introduce an asynchronous enumerator, which allows us to iterate over a type asynchronously. And it would look something like this. Hey, wait for the next item. As soon as the next item goes, go ahead and trigger it and start iterating. And now I can go trigger those events asynchronously, assuming I've got asynchronous, I've locked my code appropriately. But that's kind of laborious, that code's a lot. What if I could just do this? And so async streams is not only the introduction of some new interfaces like iasync stream, iasync disposable, and iasync enumerator, but also some new syntax that allows you to change the code from here into here. So huge benefit, but this matters to, I don't know why I said T there. That's a syntax error. Yeah, I guess it works actually. Then you can go ahead and do that. Questions? Yes.
Could you substitute T for bar?
Yes. Could you substitute for? Yes. And that's, you have to, have me do a code review of your code. So, in actual fact, so the question was, can you substitute T with var? Yeah, and the answer is yes. I think that would work. What's interesting about it is I don't think you have any idea what var would be, what the data type would be. So I would suggest that that's not the best practice. But what do I know about C#? Okay. Any other questions? Here's an interesting feature. So far, everything I've talked about can be done through compiler features alone. Okay, so I can go ahead and introduce the feature. I can add new data types in some cases, like the iasync enumerator. I can add new data types, or the index, or the range. I add new data types. I can use those data types in C#7. and then I can improve the syntax by changing the compiler, and everything just works. So the only team that has to worry about the change is the C# language team. That's it. Introduce a new type, done. This feature is way more difficult. The reason that this feature is way more difficult is it requires me to change IL. Because introducing the concept that we can have default implementation in an interface requires changing to the runtime, not just the language. So the likelihood that this makes it is much more difficult. Okay, it doesn't mean it won't make it, but it means we actually need to ensure that there's a co-release of both the language and the runtime at the same time. So we just released 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. Those are no big deal because they were compiler-only features. Like C#, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. But to introduce this feature, we have to have the runtime updated as well. Yes, you had a question before I explain the feature. This is great.
Is this similar to like the Java 8?
Yeah, so the question is this similar to concepts that have happened in Java? And the answer is yes. So, the feature, to talk about it clearly, it is the concept that in the interface I can provide a default implementation. Okay, in the interface I can provide a default implementation. Why would this be a good feature?
It's like dual inheritance in a way.
It could potentially enable multiple inheritance. That's a true statement. This would be a way of getting multiple inheritance with implementation, not just because you have multiple inheritance through interfaces. It's not really multiple inheritance, but yes. But here we can get actually multiple inheritance in interfaces. Yes, that's true, but that wasn't the motivating feature.
I would use something like this to avoid having an abstract base class that has some shared functionality. I just put it right in the interface.
So another reason you might do this is to avoid having an abstract base class that has the default functionality that people then have to use their one and only derivation from to go again. This would work. There's another reason why this feature is interesting. Yes?
It's going to reduce like redundant code if there's multiple things using that interface that all do it the same way, correct?
That's true. So it could reduce redundancy because the default is provided and I could just go ahead and use the default. That's true in a lot of cases, which is similar to what this gentleman said here. Well, what if, Christian said, sorry, that what if we went ahead and used a base class? We could use the base class to achieve the same purpose. Those are all true statements. There's something else that this does. There's a fairly rigorous rule or guideline in C# that is once an interface is released, it cannot be changed. And the reason we say that is if we change an interface once it has been released and somebody else implements the interface and you go add a member, their compile will break and you will have broken version compatibility. However, if we allow you to define a default implementation of the new member in the interface, then when somebody else implements that interface, there will be a default implementation and their code will not break because it will be there. Now, I'm assuming we're ignoring like reflection scenarios or just weird cases, right? But in general, we're saying by introducing a member into an interface and giving it a default implementation, it is still required. It needs to be done, but the definition of what is to be done is inside the interface.
So it's like the concept of an optional parameter to apply to interfaces.
It's the I don't know. The concept here is you must implement this member, but I'm going to give you a default version of the implementation. Now, my caution about this is what is the likelihood that you could come up with a good default implementation? Right? It's questionable that you could actually do that. Your default implementation might be throw an exception, right? Not implement an exception. But it turns out, even if you did that, nobody in the existing code would be calling that member. So it might actually be a reasonable default. But it still allows me to introduce the member.
What does this get you the extension methods? Can't hardly do it.
What is this
Can you
provide?
write extension methods against interfaces?
No. So extension methods do not work to implement interfaces. So the question was, can I just use extension methods instead? And the answer is no. An extension method does not implement an interface. Even if it did, you would have to introduce an extension method on object, because you don't know all the data types that need to be extended. And so that wouldn't be a complete solution. It's a great suggestion, right? I mean, it definitely means something that's been wrestled with, but it's not a complete solution. Yes?
When you do want to make your own version of the method, I guess it was the compiler going to require you to use a keyword like override.
So the question was, what is the compiler going to do in terms of implementing your own method? And the answer is yes, this is going to be an implementation. You need to go ahead and use override.
Just implement it.
I think you can just implement it in the interface. In the interface case, you can just go ahead and implement it. I don't know. This feature is not something I've actually been coding against, so I'm not helping. I do know, and you can, this is fine, you'll find this interesting, is I can now actually, we could also, in the full implementation of this is, you could go ahead and put static members on your interfaces. You can go ahead and have public and private members on your interfaces because there may be cases where you want to refactor. Right, so this is a pretty comprehensive thing. The one thing you can't do is you can't add fields, you can't add data, you can't add storage at the interface level.
What's proposed ETA on this?
C#8.
Is there an 8 already now?
No. These are in the proposal state, which means code is being written, but it is not finalized. Almost all of these features are still under significant discussion in the language design meetings. By the way, this is all open, so if you go and look at Roslyn, C#, you'll see this discussion is all happening. You can submit your own features. I wouldn't do it in code. I would start with an issue in GitHub. I wouldn't start with code. I wouldn't even start with a proposal. You can go ahead and submit your own stuff.
Sorry if this sounds newbie, but where do we get 8? When will we get 8? So I'm using, Visual Studio 2017.
Great question.
When is it?
Yeah.
Where do you get it?
So C#8 is not available, just to be clear, it is under development. Everything I've told you is subject to, significant revolution and cancellation. But right now, the best you can do is you can download a preview that gives you nullable reference types. That's the best you can do. Or, that's not true, there's other features you can do. You can download the Roslyn compiler, and the compiler can go ahead and get any features you like, even your own features. It's available there. Lastly, you could do this. If you go to CSharp lab.io,
That's good.
Stainless. You can go to csharplab.io and you can start programming with these against in the browser, and you'll notice there's a drop down here for you to go ahead and try different versions. And that's how I've done most of my exploring and learning, because it's just an easy way to do it. You can also download LinkPad. So if you download LinkPad, you can turn on Roslyn features in LinkPad. Right now, I was just been emailing Joe, who wrote it, and he's, I don't think it has stuff besides nullable, but it is a way to play with nullable reference types. Good questions. Any other questions? So this last one is some complex pattern matching features that are under discussion. And I'll tell you, I've looked at this and And I hope that there is some improvement still to be made, because it's pretty gnarly. The syntax is pretty difficult to follow, it's hard to read. But there's a couple features being added that are worthwhile exploring and thinking about. First of all, we will have not only switch statements, but we'll have switch expressions. So you can go ahead and implement an entire method with an arrow operator, and then go ahead and put a switch expression and return something. So you'll notice in this case I'm returning a switch. I'm not actually saving a value off and doing something. I'm actually returning the entire thing. So that's one thing that we'll start to see happen is switches will become expressions. Next, you'll notice in C# 1.0, if we were we always had to have some sort of jump statement within every single case in a switch statement. So you'd have a case, and then you have to have a return, or you'd have to have a go-to, you'd have to do something within there that allowed you to escape out, or break, right? You had to do some type of jump statement in your cases. You'll notice that I don't have any jump statements, and each of the cases are actually expressed with expressions. Sounds kind of strange. They're expressed with expressions. So now we can change the switch syntax to use expressions, which means you have to return something. The expression has to go ahead and return a value. It has to match the data type of your switch expression, and then I don't need to have a jump at the end of my case. So those are a couple things to think about. Then using existing syntax in C# 7, we no longer are limited to types that can be expressed with literals. We can now use any type in our switch expression. That was true in C# 7. So you'll notice here I'm passing a person, and that's not a string. It's exactly, it's a person type. You can imagine it's an imaginary person type. We can go and return that. And then we can say, hey, let's just go and match on the type. Let's go match on professor, let's match on student. And we could do that already. But then we're adding syntax that says, oh, in addition, we want to declare variables that are established and then can be used later on in your syntax. In this case here, I'm doing a little bit more than that. No, not that one. Oh, so here we're actually going into subtypes. So we're taking the student and we're finding what the advisor is, and then we're actually going to declaring of their advisor's last name. So we're actually going into subtypes of the class. So this can be pretty deep. And then we can do pattern matching. In this case, we're saying we care about the first name. We declare a variable for the first name, and then we can go ahead and use it. But I can also go ahead and declare a filter. Instead of using where, like you do in C# 7, we can now declare a filter and say the enrollment status has to be enrolled. Okay, so now we not only are we declaring variables in these two cases, but we're actually going to go ahead and do some filtering on the type. Lastly, we've got a catch-all. If none of those work, then this is a new way of declaring default. And finally, if it's null, then we can handle the null scenario. This is not comprehensive syntax, so there's still several more examples, but I feel like there's likely to be significant churn in this area, and so this is an overview of what's happened in pattern matching and what we'll see coming down. Okay, what features have you desperately wanted that I've not demonstrated?
What about records? Are they going
Records. So records are in discussion. Yes, record types are definitely in discussion. There is a proposal that's for records. For those of you who don't know, a record is basically a shorthand syntax for declaring a type that just has properties on it, and the properties are initialized with a constructor. And so you can just declare a type. For example, I can say class, person, parentheses, string, first name, comma, string, last name, close parentheses, done. Semicolon.
Kind of like a struct, but as a value?
It is a reference type because I declare this
kind of like a
class.
struct, but as a reference?
It's got nothing to do with this reference or value type. It's the fact that I don't have to declare a body. I only declare, let me just go through this so I can write this in the next one. Is that big enough? Okay, so class, person, string, first, name, comma, string, last name. That's it. And now I have a person class with a property first name and a property last name and a constructor that takes first name and last name. And likely a deconstructor too, but that's, it's still experimental. So that's it, your type class is declared. I'm sort of struggling with the fact that first name would be uppercase in my constructor. So I'm hoping that, that's, maybe they'll go and change first name to be lowercase, Pascal case instead of camel case, or camel case rather than Pascal case, but so far that's not happening. Other features that you desperately want.
Did enums get any love on CSharp 8, or are they getting any love on CSharp 8?
I don't know of any changes to enums. Okay, questions? Oh, so I think I talked about, whoops. I guess that's it. Any questions?
I might have not clarified it in the line when you're giving the presentation, but in your article you said extensions on everything. Did you kind of fold that into the interface implementation or the?
Yeah, so the extensions on everything is basically you can go ahead and declare extension methods on everything, and we're pretty close to everything already in C# 7. But there are some corner cases that I don't remember. I think indexes and a couple others you can basically do extension methods on. So extension methods, that's not the right word. Expressions, right? So you can just go ahead and use your arrow operator to implement the rest of the things that haven't been done before. That's a feature that I sort of take for granted, so I didn't know. Thank you. Other questions? Okay. Well, that's it.
With the 8, so you say it may or may not be in there. I mean, what is the deadline and what do we know would be in there?
The deadline is Visual Studio 2019. I'm guessing what the name is. I don't have any internal information here. That would be the deadline. And what happens is exposed currently in the language on GitHub. That's where it would come out. I think there's still quite a ways to go. If you look at nullable reference types and the impact it has on libraries alone, there's still quite a bit of work to be done, but it is happening. I think at this point, if I was to hazard a guess, I think we'll see the nullable reference types will be included. I think the range index stuff will be included. There's almost certainly going to be some improvements to additional features added to pattern matching. And after that, who knows? Let's see. I did ask Mads just the other day. I said, "Hey, Mads, who's responsible for the language, or one of the people responsible for the language, hey, when should I write, my next C# 8 article?" And that's still undecided. So that tells you how solidified it is. It's not all solidified.
Well, he was showing it off at the last conference. I saw the video.
So did I say it again?
And Mads was showing off a lot of those features you mentioned, kind of making it sound like, yeah, this is coming.
No, I agree. I mean, I think we're saying it is coming, but I mean, Mads confirmed features for me in the past. Like he personally said, yes, this will be there, and then it didn't happen, right? And there's valid reasons for those changes. So
It's kind of like software development.
yeah, no, that's a great line. It's kind of like software development. That's good. That's a great line. I think I'll use that. Okay, do we want to?
Yeah, we can do
You got a
it.
book here or something?
We've got a book here. I guess I'll let you draw one. Okay.
I'll take payments. Steve, you got a question?
I'll wait for you.
It's Tori.
If you'll be able to read it.
Drexler.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
There you go. Thank you all for coming.
Steve, you got a question?
I have a
Aaron, we've got a JetBrains license. Can you want me $10? I think it's worth a little bit more than $10. I'm pretty sure. It's worth more than my book, I know that much. Cammy. There you go.
So, see Steve after.
There you go.
Great. What about questions on previous editions maybe, C#?
Do you guys have any questions on previous C# versions and things like that? How many of you guys, I'd be curious, how many of you using C# 7? How many of you using features in C# 7? Which one? Which ones?
Local functions.
Local functions, I used that tonight. Good, what else?
I use range the other day.
Range, the same range that I showed here? Yeah, it's the same one. Cool.
Question mark for exception.
Question mark for, so
Double question mark for
yeah,
exception.
yeah. So the feature there is the fact that there are expressions for throw statements. So a throw statement is now an expression, not just a statement. Wait, I said that badly. You can now throw as an expression, not just as a statement. And getting terminology is hard. And the one I'm surprised nobody said is tuples.
I was gonna say.
I still have been programming that.
Somehow they feel like they've been with us all along.
Yeah. So I got a question about tuples. How many of you are exposing tuples on your interfaces? So rather than declaring a class, you return a tuple on an I don't mean an interface, I mean in your public API, you return a tuple.
Sometimes.
Steve,
Why, I don't understand why it matters. I know it's considered bad practice, or at least that's what I've heard, but you're locking somebody into some sort of return type anyway, whether it's a class or, class of these three properties versus the people.
So the question was, well, I'm going to rephrase it as a question. Would it be bad if you did that? Would it be bad to expose a tuple in your public API? And should there be a guideline saying don't do it? So the best reason I can think of, and I'm just thinking about it on top of my head, the best reason I can think of is it doesn't work in earlier versions of the language. So if somebody's coding against you in C# 6 and you're writing a public API, they don't get the feature, they just get to call them item 1 and item 2. But it does compile, it still works. But it's called item 1 and item 2, they don't get the naming feature if you're programming against. So if you're writing a public API and you're writing a library that somebody else is likely to use, I would probably discourage it from at least from those types of APIs. If this is your API and you know anyone calling it, it's probably less significant. So that's the one reason I know you should avoid it. What I do find interesting about it is that Microsoft introduced the feature, and it's none of Microsoft's APIs have it. So I find that's generally a good indication to me, or an indication to me I should be very wary of deciding, I have an exception to the rule, for not doing it. But the only one that I know of for sure is language backwards compatibility and that way it goes. The other thing I would say interesting about tuple is you should use tuples in place of anonymous types. In almost all cases, there is performance reasons why you wouldn't, but in almost all cases you use tuples rather than anonymous types. Yes?
So in your experience, I guess working in Microsoft and talking to them, because I'm very familiar with that whole subculture or sub-world of Microsoft now being open source, working in GitHub, having projects like that, like Roslyn. In your experience, what's the makeup of that community? Is it mostly Microsoft engineers working and we just kind of watch them publicly, or is there actual involvement from people outside of Microsoft?
Yeah, there's a significant involvement from people outside Microsoft. Interesting enough, I just wrote on how to contribute, I just wrote an article, it comes out in October, I would guess, on how to contribute to Microsoft open source. And it turns out you can start by going to a documentation page and seeing a spelling error and correcting it. Like it's trivial, it's that easy. It's done on a wiki page, you just correct the wiki, you can just go to GitHub, open it up and change it, or you can submit the documentation. And you are changing the source code for .NET.
It's like pull request, right? Like somebody at Microsoft that has to approve it.
So if you do a documentation change, it is a pull request, and the documentation, you don't even have to make a pull request. It happens for you automatically underneath the covers. If you change code, it is a pull request. You change code against master, and you do need to submit a pull request, and somebody, either inside or outside Microsoft, but most likely inside, is going to go ahead and review that pull request. There is a site that if you go and look for issues that are marked as first issue or good first issue, I think is the tag in GitHub. If you go look for good first issue, those are the things that the Roslyn team is committed to making sure they tell you which file you should most likely need to change. They'll tell you where to put your tests that you need to go to verify this, because they basically come across a bug, somebody reported, and instead of them fixing it, they've actually made it available easily for the community to participate in and to start getting your feet wet and started to do that. And then as you get more experience, you can actually go ahead and do pull requests and start implementing features. Just so we're clear, what I think you're insinuating here is, hey, but Microsoft is still approving any changes that you make. And the answer is 99.9% of the scenarios, yes. And does that mean it's not open source? My first comment is, it is open source because you can fork the repo anytime you like and do what the heck you want. And it is totally possible. And if the community follows you, good for you. And if the community doesn't, then maybe you didn't do the right thing. Maybe it wasn't a nice feature to add. You should be a little bit more cautious about it. But it is still 100%, no doubt, it is open source. Right? It is there for you to use. It has licenses that I use. You can put it in your product. You can do whatever you want with it. And it is yours 100%. And you can get everyone else to submit pull requests against your stuff. But I am very grateful that Microsoft doesn't accept everything, including, by the way, my own stuff, right? I mean, I can say firsthand, I've submitted stuff and I've been really glad that there's a really clever person on the other side goes, Mark, you didn't do blah, 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 blah. And so there's sort of different levels. I've talked about changing documentation, and I've talked about, hey, going ahead and looking for first issues and just modifying things that are fairly easy. And there's actually people assigned by Microsoft. If an issue is decorated with good first issue, there's somebody employed at Microsoft who is responsible for coaching you to success for getting that pull request merged and incorporated and closed. Right? So they're actually working hard to make you successful to submit code, and they will even delay. If you have two people submit and one's a first issue and they've never submitted something before, and somebody else fixed the issue and they have done something before, they will delay accepting theirs and favor getting yours in there because they want to encourage people to get their hands dirty in getting code changed. And then we start to sort of move up. Okay, so now I'm going to start modifying the library. Well, I've decided I have always wanted to have this capitalized in my CSharp code. Great, go ahead and submit an issue, and there's like a ton of ways to do this, right? So it starts out, you don't start with code. You literally go to GitHub and you post an issue. And not exaggeration. And then the issue gets discussed by the community ad nauseum. Like, I subscribe to this thread, and there are more emails coming through that thread than I can possibly keep up with, right? It's just, oh my goodness. It's a good thing there's a mute button on my email, because otherwise I would see way too many things. So you can start with an issue, but now you're submitting to like a Roslyn feature, or runtime feature, or a language feature, and it starts at that level of just discussion inside the issue. Once the significant traction happens, the language design team will take it up, and they'll bring it into the language design team and say, hey, do we have somebody who wants to champion this feature? And if there's somebody in the language design meeting that says, yes, I champion it, they will go write a proposal, collaborate with you, you guys will produce the proposal together, and that'll end up going into review at the proposal stage. And at some point it'll be approved, and we're going to say, yes, this is a good proposal, let's go write the implementation. And then they'll start writing the code, and that code is not kept up to date with master. Because guess what? It's probably a big feature, and you probably changed a ton of stuff, and it's not kept up, but now you can use and test it. In fact, things that I'm showing you in here are not kept up with master. Right? Null reference is a separate branch that has 3,000 and something changes that is not kept up. And those are all dealt with individually, because there's a good chance those features won't make it. And at some point in time, they go, okay, let's start merging this stuff together, and start going through master merge and bringing stuff in. It is a very significant process to get something into Roslyn or something into or the language and stuff like that. And from my perspective, that's a really good thing, right? The last thing I want is for us to end up like C++ or some other language. Like and so, but you can, 100%, it's open source, you can participate as much, as little as you like. There's also a code of conduct. And it turns out, if you're going to be a jerk, you will not be invited back and you will be banned. And I think that is also a good thing, that the code of conduct is totally reasonable. And if you come back as somebody else, you will still be banned, right? It doesn't work. So, in terms of actually contributing, you can really contribute. I hesitate to say this, but I will throw this out. At IntelliTect, we've been working on a library. It's not confidential, so it's okay to say this. But we've been working on system.command line. So there's no one parser to rule them all in .NET. There hasn't been a parser for command line parsing since CSharp 1.0. There's been a whole bunch of people that submitted and tried. The most recent, attempt has been the CLI, the .NET CLI. They've got a new parser. They started from scratch. John got in there and he wrote the new parser from scratch. And that wasn't adopted as like V1 to rule them all. And so we've been collaborating within IntelliTect. We've been collaborating with Microsoft and building system.command line. It's a new namespace. It's going to have a parser in it. It's going to have a renderer in it. Go ahead and sport colors and all sorts of things. And we're working on that. Mostly Kevin and I have been doing that. Steve did a significant contribution around the help. To give you more information about that, we've been working on this probably 6 months, and we still don't know what the API is going to look like. And these are really good developers, with the exception of me, of course, but the rest of the team is really good. They know what they're doing, and we don't even have a clue. Like, we've done it. I think we've done 4 different iterations of APIs that are radically different. One of them requires a language change to C#. One of them uses attributes, one of them uses functional programming. We've got also, but it really gives you an introduction of how hard it is to write really first-class, awesome software and APIs. So I do make that available. Genuinely, if you guys are interested, send me an email, we'll figure out how to include you in that. It's cool it's happening here in Spokane, right? That we're doing this. Software that runs on millions of computers. We'll see. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everyone.